let's tackle one of the biggest, deepest mysteries out there. How can you possibly know if a mind is active when the body can't respond at all? I mean, what does it feel like to be trapped inside your own head? And how could anyone on the outside ever know you're in there? This is the quest to find a real, definitive test for consciousness. So let's go back to late 2005. There's a 23-year-old woman who's been in what seems like a coma for 5 months after a really bad car accident. To everyone looking at her, she's completely unresponsive. Medically, there are just no clinical signs that she's aware of anything. But then, something absolutely incredible happens. A neuroscientist named Adrian Owen puts her inside an fMRI scanner, and he asks her to do something really simple. Imagine you're playing a game of tennis, and what he saw on the scan was, well, it was astonishing. The parts of her brain tied to movement, they just lit up, exactly like they would if she were actually out on a court, swinging a racket. This wasn't just some random flicker of brain activity. No, this was proof. Proof that she could hear, she could understand, and she could choose to follow his command. A whole hidden world, suddenly right there on the screen. And it turns out she was far from the only one. A really groundbreaking study from 2024 dropped a bombshell statistic. About 1 in 4 people who look physically unresponsive after a brain injury actually show these hidden signs of awareness. Just let that sink in for a second. 1 in 4. That number is just staggering. And it makes us ask some really tough questions about patient care, about recovery, and about what it even means to be conscious. Okay, so how in the world do scientists actually search for consciousness in these incredibly difficult cases? Well, neuroscientist Marcello Massimini has a great analogy. He says it's like peeling an onion. You have to start at the outermost layer and just keep working your way in, getting closer and closer to the core of the problem with every single layer you peel back. So how do we go about finding these hidden sparks of a conscious mind? The thing is, there's no single magic bullet. We have to work through the layers. Layer 1 is the most straightforward, behavioral cues. You know, a doctor asks, can you squeeze my hand twice? If you get a response, that's a clear sign. Then you've got layer 2, which is that tennis test we just talked about, using active brain scans to see if a mind can follow a command. But what if a person can't focus for that long? Well, that's when you have to go deeper, down to layers 3 and 4, using more passive scans and even measuring the brain's own fundamental properties. But here's the catch with that tennis test. It's actually a really high bar to clear. It takes several minutes of just pure, sustained focus. And let's be real, even healthy people like you and me, our minds wander. In fact, that same 2024 study found that among patients who were already showing some outward signs of being aware, only 38% of them could pass the active brain scan test. So failing the test doesn't mean no one's home. It just means we need to peel back another layer of that onion. And this brings us to the deepest layer, the very core. Instead of asking the brain to do something, what if we could just measure its raw capacity for consciousness? That is the wild idea behind something called the Perturbational Complexity Index, or PCI. Think of it like this. Scientists give the brain a tiny, harmless magnetic tap, and then they listen for the echo. A conscious, awake brain, it rings like a complex bell, creating this rich, intricate pattern. But a brain that's asleep or under anesthesia, it just kind of thuds. The PCI can actually detect that ring of consciousness even when a person is totally cut off from the outside world. So we're getting a lot better at finding consciousness when it's hidden in humans. But what about other kinds of minds? The quest for consciousness doesn't just stop with our own species. I mean, how do you even begin to look for it in a mind as wonderfully alien as an octopus? And this is a perfect example of the challenge. You can't ask an octopus what it's feeling. So researchers had to get creative. They set up an experiment where they gave octopuses a painful stimulus in one specific chamber. What happened next was fascinating. The octopuses started to consistently avoid that chamber, even if it had been their favorite spot before. This points to something way deeper than just a simple reflex. It really hints that they don't just feel the pain in the moment, but they remember the unpleasant experience and actively try to avoid it. This slide really lays out the different toolkits we have to use. With humans, we've got the huge advantage of language. We can just ask them to do things. But with animals, we have to get much more creative. We're looking for behaviors that suggest sentience, the ability to have feelings and sensations like pleasure or pain. So we look for things like avoiding pain, and we can even adapt some of our human tests. For instance, the PCI has been used on rats, and it shows patterns that are remarkably similar to ours. And all of this research is having a massive real-world impact. Just last year, a group of leading scientists signed a groundbreaking declaration. They formally stated that there's strong scientific support for consciousness, not just in mammals and birds, but a realistic possibility across a huge range of the animal kingdom. And this isn't just some academic debate either. The evidence for sentience in animals like octopuses and crabs has already led to them getting more legal protections under the UK's Animal Welfare Act. Science is literally changing how we view and how we treat other living beings. All right, let's go to the final frontier, the one that until very recently was pure science fiction, artificial intelligence. Can a machine, just a piece of software, actually have an inner life? And if it could, how on earth would we ever be able to test for it? We've all seen this, right? You go to a chatbot, you type in, "Are you conscious?" and it spits out this really thoughtful, sometimes kind of eerie answer. But what does that answer actually prove? Does it prove anything at all? Well, the expert consensus on this is a pretty firm no. As the philosopher Tim Bain says, we just can't take an AI's word for it. And why not? Because these large language models are designed to do one thing and one thing only: predict the next word to mimic human text. They're trained on mountains of data to figure out the most probable human-sounding response. So when it says it's conscious, it's not having a subjective experience. It's just repeating patterns it learned from us. So yeah, we need a totally different playbook here. Researchers are brainstorming some really clever ideas. For instance, does an AI's internal processing look anything like the way our brains create consciousness? Or, and I love this one, what if you trained an AI on a massive data set that has every single mention of consciousness scrubbed from it, and then see if it can somehow figure out what an inner life is on its own? It's really important to stress, though, that for now, these are just ideas. We have zero established tests for consciousness in machines. Okay, so we've got tests for humans, different kinds of tests for animals, and these theoretical tests for AI. The ultimate goal, really the holy grail in this field, is to tie all of these threads together. Could there possibly be a single, universal sign of consciousness? A one-size-fits-all test that would work no matter what kind of mind you're looking at? And scientists have a pretty smart roadmap for how to get there. It's a step-by-step process. First, you take a whole battery of tests and you validate them on the one group we are absolutely sure is conscious: healthy, awake, adult humans. The tests that work really well get a high score. Then you move to a slightly different state, like people under anesthesia, and you see which tests correctly spot the lack of consciousness. You just keep repeating this process, expanding outward to more and more different systems, from brain-injured patients to animals, and maybe, one day, to an AI. You build confidence by seeing if all the different lines of evidence point in the same direction. But there is a huge philosophical roadblock here, a deep skepticism that's voiced by leading thinkers like neuroscientist Christoph Koch. And his point is this: without a widely accepted scientific theory for what consciousness is and how it even happens, we can't really build a universal test for it. He says it's like trying to build a thermometer without having a theory of heat. We can only really trust our tests on other humans because that's the only case where we actually know the right answer to begin with. And that leaves us right here with this one final, massive question. Because this whole quest, it's not just some abstract scientific puzzle. The stakes could not be higher. The answers we find will eventually guide life or death medical decisions. They will shape our laws on animal welfare. And they're going to determine the entire ethical future of artificial intelligence. So as we get closer and closer to finding a real test, we have to ask ourselves, what happens when we finally find an answer? Are we going to be ready for it?